I smile when I see dogs. I'm a huge dog fan.
So, as the journey begins to explore what makes us happy, it takes me all the way to Scandinavia, Denmark, the first stop. So, is it the hygge that keeps the Danish so happy? Or is it the fact that there are colorful buildings everywhere you look? Or just the fact that there are 6 times more bikes than cars in this city? Are these the reasons why the Danish always feature within the top 3 happiest countries according to the World Happiness Reports? Well, I'm here to explore this. Danish hygge is one, I guess, you could take forever trying to understand, or you could just try and just feel it. And that's ultimately what the past week has been, trying to feel what it is about happiness in Denmark that translates to the hygge, and how can we transpose that to other societies if possible. And I guess the interesting finding more so is trying to understand how do we find purpose, and ultimately purpose leads us to happiness according to one model which is very prevalent through Aristotle's thinking. And I do present you with the question, what is your purpose? Because inevitably that is linked to the internalization of what happiness is to us, irrespective of the external factors. But between now and then, I'm just going to tuck into the little book of Leica, which is Danish for happiness, and hopefully we shall come to our own understanding of what our own happiness is on this journey.
I would like to do, that would be a really cool study, and to some extent I guess that's what we're doing. Can we explore and identify more in terms of how we can make people smile? I smile when I see dogs. I'm a huge dog fan, and my girlfriend is sick of me because every time we're going for a walk, I always point out when there's dogs in sight.
Right.
But that would be interesting. Is there something
Universal?
yes that makes people smile? I think that would be an interesting study to do.
Absolutely. I mean, I wouldn't even know how to begin that, but that would be really interesting to, because then how would one even go about doing that? Well, asking people?
No, I think you would have to test it.
All right. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
come up with various proposed ideas, and then try those all out
Yeah.
and see.
Yeah.
But then again, the context would be incredibly important. So going to all these diverse, different countries and exploring that. That's really, I mean, interesting. I mean, I have a couple of questions just in terms of happiness in general, because I try to understand why Denmark. You know, I mean, I've read enough things that give very great arguments as to why that is the case, but because then, if based on the theories as to why Denmark is, then therefore there's some places that can never be completely happy because of some of the fundamentals, like the healthcare, the education system, the social provisions. There's some countries that are never going to be that.
I think never is a strong word.
Well, I can't. Okay, right. I mean, that is.
I mean, I was telling you what I did last week in terms of looking at encyclopedias from
Right.
the 1700s.
Right.
I think a lot have happened since that
Right,
period.
this
right?
is true. Okay,
So I think
okay. Right, absolutely. I mean, that's true for bringing me back to the
Right.
to the optimistic person that I am. But I think just obviously, as you highlighted as well in the book, it's so easy to really get bogged down by all the negativity that happens in
Yeah.
the world globally. I mean, I remember your story about being in Paris and you know, the day before the U.S. election results came
Day
out,
after,
and
yeah.
all the other
Yeah.
factors
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
at that moment contributed to you not feeling happy in that moment. But as you highlighted, the cognitive aspect of it, you were still happy. But so sometimes it's so easy to get bogged down with those other things, and that's why for me, I guess living in London, and being African as well, realizing that fundamentally the political system in a lot of African countries, in England, just the economic imbalance, the overwhelming xenophobia that's growing, all of these other subtle factors somewhat make it, which on the surface, from what I've deduced of Denmark, some of those factors are not that evident. So therefore, is it a losing battle thinking that that could be transposed to maybe not the whole country, but even a subset of people that still they are subjected to the results of those other variables that they don't have any control over, if that makes any sense.
I'm not sure what the question is.
So the question is, can does it just work because this is Denmark and everything in here, those other variables that people are not personally in control of, are stacked in a favor of just of them feeling happy, not having to worry about those other things? Whereas if you transpose that into another country like England, is it possible to actually ever expect to attain that level of happiness within there, even though those other factors, people cannot change them? And
Right.
actually it doesn't seem as though in this current state that we are looking like we're moving towards it.
So there's two questions, but because I'm I'm still going to challenge, is it, whether it's possible to change that on a short term? Probably
Okay,
not.
okay,
On a
okay.
long term, I think that's a
Right,
different.
okay,
difference.
okay.
But I think, maybe we can boil the question down to, so is the Nordic model the only model?
Okay.
And no, because if we take the world happiness, yes, the Nordic countries are always doing well in that one, always in the top 10, but so is Switzerland. And the Swiss model is a completely different model compared to the Nordic model.
Right, okay.
Less equality, less social security, yet they are still doing as well, sometimes even better than Denmark, and sometimes better than the other countries. So I don't think necessarily that the only way forward to that level that Denmark is experiencing in terms of happiness levels is a single model.
Right.
The Australian model is also different from the Danish model. What does work in the Danish model is a focus on reducing extreme unhappiness, reducing anxiety, reducing stress, reducing worry, which I think is a very sort of cost-efficient model,
Right.
if you want to use that term, because I think it's much easier to bring somebody up from a 4 to a 5 than a person from a 9 to a 10.
Right.
So I think there is a lot from within the Nordic model that other countries could take inspiration from, long term and short term. But I think there's also perhaps other paths to reach that level of happiness from a national average point of view than necessarily a single model.
Okay. And then another question I also want to ask is, within Denmark, there is minority groups. There is I won't use the word influx of migrants because that's not the case, but there has been, and there are pockets of migrant communities here. So I'm also intrigued to know if they also, because as you said, it's an average. So within that, there are obviously people who are way below.
Yep.
And but as a general average, it comes up to 7 point.
So, super good question, and two reports you should look at. One is the 2018 World Happiness Report from March, because that was the first report that looked at, yes, once again, happiness levels in average happiness levels in different countries,
Right.
but also had a ranking on happiness levels for, they call them foreign borns. So would be people like my grandmother, who was Germany, came to Denmark, people like your parents. And what is their happiness level? So in Denmark, in the UK, in the US, in the different countries where they have enough data, and comparing those two rankings, what is the average happiness level for the entire population, and what is the average happiness level for the foreign-born part of the population in different countries. And that shows a correlation. So if a country is relatively good at producing good conditions for good lives, it will also be relatively good at providing good conditions for good lives for people coming into the country, which I think is great news.
Right.
From a nerdy scientific point of view, it was also great to see that people coming into different countries from the same countries, say, was it Nigeria?
Nigeria, yeah.
So people coming from Nigeria going to the UK, like your parents, or people coming from Nigeria going to Canada, to UK, to Canada, would converge towards the host countries or their new countries' happiness level. So Canada is slightly above the UK in the World Happiness Report, meaning that Nigerians coming to Canada would have a higher happiness level. And that's the reason why it's great from a scientific point of view, because then we can see that it's not so much necessarily about the cultural perception of happiness that determines the outcomes. It's the actual circumstance in those different countries that determine the happiness level. So that's one report.
Okay.
Another report is one we just published last week,
Okay.
2 weeks ago, recently,
Okay.
in English,
Okay.
which is called In the Shadow of Happiness.
Okay.
So we did it for the Nordic Council of Ministers, where we looked at happiness gaps or inequalities in happiness in the Nordic countries, because we wanted to move the agenda forward, as you're doing now also, and creating a better understanding and more nuances, because often we always just hear about, the Nordic countries happiest in the world, but as you also said, there's people above that average and there's people below that average. And one thing is talking about averages, another thing is talking about the distribution.
Okay.
So you could have a country where the happiness level is 5, and everybody answers 5 to how happy they are, or a country where half answer 10 and the other half answer 0.
Right.
They will have the same average, but it's going to be two very different countries. So it's very important, I think, to ask that question and start to look at well-being from an equality or inequality.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I guess maybe the final question is, do you think there's any, so for example, with something as specific as like Rising Youth Violence, how do you think, based on any of the research that you've conducted or just anything that you think about, that there could be a sense of agency in how a person can be empowered to use any tools to boost their own happiness levels, even though all those kind of social, political variables are not in their power?
I think my instinct would point us towards happiness from Aristotle's point of view,
Right.
the purposeful life,
right,
meaning,
Right.
and helping people, which is super difficult, I think, find that sense of purpose or meaning in life. I think a lot of positive things come from that. Resilience, happiness, but perhaps also a reduction in worry, stress, hostility, feeling that you are needed, that you are doing something of value, of worth. And I'm not talking in terms of monetary, but in terms of you have value and worth as a human for being. I think making that connection and helping people understand that connection would be where I would search for answers. I don't have the answer for it, but that would be within that landscape. I would look for them.
Thank you. I mean, that's really interesting to hear because I'm gonna develop a series of workshops because my art forms are mainly photography, poetry, and I guess interactive artistic expressions. So to create workshops with specifically, I'm going to be working with 50 young black boys who have been in and around sort of youth violence, criminal justice system for a 6-month period, and then within that 6 months, sort of measure their levels and of how happy or they feel within themselves over the period of 6 months. But then obviously, to design the workshops, I'm trying to then incorporate a lot of research-led findings and knowing how to use those findings alongside the artistic expressions, be it poetry, creative writing, photography, to get them to explore and find the purpose.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really why I wanted to ask and find out how you might think that could be achieved in that sort of time frame, perhaps.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for.
Yeah, sorry I didn't have better time.
I mean, this is more than enough time that I expected. Because you're an incredibly busy man, so...
I still have time to smile.
That's always great. That's absolutely great. So that's...
Thanks, Kate.
So this is just the beginning to try and understand the variables that affect our happiness. Do we have any agency over these things? Well, this curiosity to understand what role we play in aligning our own happiness and taking responsibility and trying to curate the variables in a hope that inevitably brings happiness and thus making us smile along the way. Well, this is the journey, and I'm intrigued to see what more we find.